Hi again. This is the third and final part of my lecture on democracy after sovereignty, rethinking constituent power. Again, I'm going to share my screen. So from here, having outlined this element of representation in the formation of constituent power that I think Schmidt's account distinctively introduces to our theoretical understanding of democratic collective agency, I want to take that idea, the discursive representation of the people, back to Sieyes's text and see what work it's doing in his argument. So contrary to Schmidt, we don't find in Sieyes's text any account of the demos as a metaphysical or transcendental subject, no mystical unity that exists prior to or beyond the political constitution. Rather, what Sieyes offers us is a methodologically and normatively individualistic account of the process by which people become conscious of their common interests and come to be able to share, to distinguish these from their particular interests. As I've sketched in my summary of the three-stage sequence through which constituent power is activated and exercised, related in chapter 5 of Sieyes's text, representation is an instrumental device whereby the individual members of the demos delegate the temporary exercise of their constituent authority, though not the authority itself, to their extraordinary representatives. The people are in principle capable of articulating their common interest on their own behalf through deliberation, but it's more efficient to delegate this activity to representatives in the Constituent Assembly. It's also more likely to produce the desired outcome, as the representative body, suitably shielded from capture by privileged orders, is more likely to deliver a unitary common will, to make a determinate decision than the people acting directly. So does this mean that what I'm calling the discursive representation of the demos, so important in Schmidt's account of constituent power, is missing from Sieyes, so that the only form of representation in the formation of constituent power is representation on this principal agent model of representation of interests? My answer is no. The discursive representation of the demos isn't absent from Sieyes's text. Rather, it is the text. It is the act of representation that Sieyes himself is performing through the text. He's telling the French nation who it is and trying to persuade them against the other representations of their identity as a collective agent that are also circulating in public discourse. In particular, the claims that they are a popular sovereign with a right to their absolute and arbitrary will. In the image of the nation that Sieyes offers, the demos is not an organic pre-political unity. What defines it is not an inherited identity either, based on common language, culture, or spirit. He's not using the word nation in that sense. Mocking the nobility's claims of privilege based on aristocratic lineage, for example, he writes, "Indeed, comparing lineage for lineage, might there not be some merit in pointing out to our poor fellow citizens that descent from the Gauls and the Romans might be at least as good as descent from the Sicambrians, Welches, and other savages from the woods and swamps of ancient Germania." But he quickly closes off this path to national identity. But if all lines of descent are mixed, he says, if the blood of the Franks is indistinguishable from the blood of the Gauls, and the ancestors of the Third Estate are fathers of the whole nation, can we not hope one day to see an end of that long drawn-out parricide proudly carried out every day by one class against the others, end quote. He continues, quote, "A nation is made one by virtue of a common system of law and a common representation," end quote. So again, he's refusing the shared culture account of the unity of the nation. What then of his statement that, quote, the nation exists prior to everything, it is the origin of everything, end quote? We find his answer in the title of the first chapter of the text. The third estate is the complete nation. What's a nation? It's not a culture. It's a system of social cooperation that produces general prosperity and well-being through its division of labor, which includes what he calls private employments, the production of goods and services for exchange on the market, and public services, security, legal regulation, education, and the administration of public affairs. The third estate, Sieyès argues, is everything because its members perform all these socially beneficial roles. The nobility, in contrast, is entirely parasitic on their exertions. These productive and useful activities interact in a complex system that is prior to the constituted political order in the dual sense that without it, the public order could not exist. It generates the wealth that the state taxes to finance its activities, and because its smooth operation is the condition for its members' freedom and well-being, and the primary purpose of government. In short, Sieyès' image of the nation identifies it with commercial society. His is a distinctly materialist account of the nation. In this sense, he can be read, and some have read him, as a precursor to Marx. He celebrates the aroused consciousness of the third estate as to the truth of its central place in the society as a whole. Truth can be left to slumber among a people accustomed to servility, he writes, but one would have to be blind not to see how happily our nation has grasped some of those fertile principles that lead to everything that is good, just, and useful, end quote. At the center of this image, again, is his view of the division of labor as something that has developed historically and transformed the character of the third estate as a class. It contingently maps onto the territorial boundaries of the French state, but it's not a derivative account of the boundaries of the demos, such as I sketched earlier, in which a sense of shared membership in a political community arises out of the experience of living under a common order of law. Rather, the division of labor has developed because of changes in economic production, technology, and communication. Quote, try as the privileged may want to close their eyes to the revolution produced by the force of circumstance and the passage of time, it is no less real. Once upon a time, the third estate consisted of serfs, and the noble order was everything. Today, the third estate is everything, and nobility is simply a word, end quote. Sieyès' identification of the third estate with the nation is an historical claim, not a metaphysical or theological one. Its development was not the outgrowth of any agent's intentional choice, but the result, a nation in which the third estate is everything, that can be made the site of now a collective choice to bring a legitimate order of law into being to replace the corrupt, ineffective, and illegitimate status quo. Sieyès explicitly invites the third estate to conceive of itself, those are his words, to imagine itself in two different ways. First, as an order that has standing with the other two orders, which makes it something in the constitutional order, which is at least more than the nothing it's been until now. But this vision, which captures the third estate's current demands for its representation in the estates general, is too modest. Instead, it should imagine itself as the nation, full stop. From this perspective, quote, there is but one single order, or rather, there are none, because there is only the nation for the nation, end quote. It should have its institutional expression not in an estates general, where it plays a subordinate role, but in a national assembly, all of whose members are chosen from its ranks alone. The boundaries of the demos, in short, should be drawn to exclude the privileged classes as such. To ask what role they should play in the social order, he concludes, is, quote, like asking what kind of place a malignant tumor should have in the body of someone who is ill, as it devours and ruins its health. It simply has to be neutralized, end quote. Now, CES ultimately failed to prevent the idea of popular sovereignty from overtaking the popular imagination and shaping the course of the revolution. But the representative claim that he advanced in this text was in fact accepted in many of its proposals, including the replacement of the Estates General by a unitary National Assembly and the creation of a National Constituent Assembly, whose members were barred for a time from serving the Legislative Assembly that its members had established. His representative claim, in short, did have constitutive effects. So I've suggested that this moment of the discursive representation of the demos and its boundaries is in fact the first condition of possibility for the formation of constituent power, explicitly in Schmitt, implicitly in Sieyès. The first act is the creative one of telling a story of peoplehood whose moral is that a given collection of individuals should see itself as a demos, a political people, a collective agent capable of ordering its relationships to serve its common interests. These ethically constitutive stories about the qualities and boundaries of the demos are, contra Schmitt, not expressions of the authentic identity of the people, but are defeasible representative claims that may be accepted, rejected, contested, or amended by those to whom they are addressed. These stories should also be subject to normative criteria. Do they depict all the people? Do they depict all the people that their proposed projects would affect as equals? Do their proposals meet the test of non-domination? The standards are constraints on the kinds of stories that can count as democratic, but they're too thin to be action guiding. Having some sort of constitutive story of the character of the demos is an enabling condition for collective action by its members. Let me briefly conclude then by spelling out a bit more how I think Sieyès' materialist and constructivist account of the constituent power provides theoretical resources for making sense of the George Floyd protests and the movement for Black lives more generally, as an instance of democratic collective agency across borders. The most important thing to notice is that the protests perform what I've argued is the first act of representation in the formation of constituent power, the discursive representation of the demos and its boundaries. Like Sieyès' story about the Third Estate as the nation, it's a species of what I've called the associative account of the boundaries of the demos. People find themselves related to one another through a system of interdependence or mutual effectiveness that's not of their own intentional making, but which they can choose to make the basis of legitimate political relationship, capable of generating collective decisions that will serve their common interests, including their common interest in non-domination. In the story the protesters tell, the structure of mutual effectiveness in which we all, are enmeshed is one that produces systemic racism, a structure that's been produced by a 500-year-old history of imperialism, colonialism, and slavery. The symbolic register of the protests makes especially evident that their we narrative is a form of discursive or symbolic representation. The pulling down of statues and the banning of flags, the brief appearance of the Jen Reed statue of on Colston's plinth, the renaming of military bases, the painting of Black Lives Matter murals on streets. These express not only a form of destituent power, a dismantling of the existing order of things, but also a form of constituent power, read as a reconstitution of the symbolic order of public space. But the protests have also generated kratos in the strong sense of binding collective decisions, including formally legislated changes to defund or reform police forces, to change state flags, to institute programs of reparations for slavery, and so on, changes that institutionalize and in some cases restate explicitly the historical we narrative that the protesters have expressed, the acceptance of the story that colonialism and slavery are not merely historical injustices, but injustices that continue to reverberate in contemporary political institutions and require specific acknowledgement and redress. Still, to read the protests as an instance of democratic collective agency requires some adjustments to the view of constituent power that we can derive from the rereading of Sieyès. First, in contrast to both Sieyès and Schmitt, the agent of the discursive representation of the people, the storyteller of peoplehood, need not be a single leader or intellectual. The story can be produced collectively through the discourses generated by the activists, protesters, and ordinary citizens themselves. Second, this way of thinking about constituent power preserves the definition of democracy as the people acting together as equals to generate binding collective decision. There's still a determinate demos, and there's still a determinate kratos. But it doesn't suppose that the boundaries of the demos and the boundaries of kratos necessarily map onto each other. The demos specified by the protesters, we the people who are living within social, economic, and political structures produced by the long history of imperialism, colonialism, and slavery, is potentially global, even though it may be more densely concentrated in contexts where the legacies of slavery and colonialism most clearly shape localized structures of power, such as anti-Black racism and anti-Indigenous racism in policing in North America. In this case, however, changing the constituted powers that exercise coercive authority on the basis of a class privilege, racial privilege, doesn't necessarily entail constituting new powers at the same scale as the demos as a whole. Matters may be different for other sorts of cross-border demoi, but the general claim is this: that to understand political activity as a form of democratic agency does entail that it's capable of generating binding collective decisions, but not necessarily through a state or state-like entity organized at the same scale as the demos taken as a whole. What makes this discontinuity between the boundaries of demos and kratos normatively defensible from a democratic point of view is that the collectively binding decisions at which the protests aim all take the form of dismantling systems of racial domination as they operate in particular contexts. Finally, drawing on features of the protesters' story of peoplehood, I think we can sketch by way of hypothesis some elements of the kinds of discursive representations of the demos that could serve as the first step in the formation of democratic collective agency, which will serve as a guide for me for further research on the formation of transnational demoi. First, in their structural dimension, they depict objective or fact-based relations of interconnection that resonate with people's experience of the material conditions of their lives. Second, in their temporal dimension, they depict these relations of interconnection as durable, likely intergenerational, that is, of sufficiently long duration that they warrant the construction of lasting political institutions to regulate them. Third, in their spatial dimension, they are multi-scalar. People imagine themselves as living within complex systems of power that cross borders, but also manifest locally. This translocal character of the structure of the demos is one of the features of this way of thinking about democratic agency across borders that distinguishes it from cosmopolitan models of global democracy. And finally, with regard to the kind of agency they ask of citizens, the members of the demos in question, this spatial feature of the political imaginary encourages what I will call shape-shifting citizenship, a capacity to mobilize around the cross-border structures, but to address one's actions to different scales of constituted power, local, state, regional, global, or transnational issue-based structure, depending on the circumstances of the moment. That there's political judgment involved there. So I will leave it there and really look forward to hearing your questions and your comments and your criticisms. Thanks so much.